Okay, welcome to a very first Final Fantasy 16 discussion episode. This is going to be an additional episode to our main podcast, where today we are going to be talking about the Final Fantasy 16 trailer, talking about some of the concerns that fans have, some of the support that people have for this game, and it should be a pretty good discussion. So today I'm joined with Stan. You all know Stan. He's on every week. Mm-hmm. And then we are glad to welcome Jack from Alleyway Jack, the YouTube channel, one of my favorite YouTube channels. How are you?
Hi, guys. Yeah, thanks very much for having me on. Very well.
Very cool.
How are you guys doing?
We're doing good. It's an exciting time for Final Fantasy. So, but
yeah, absolutely.
Well, to start things off, just kind of lay the foundation here. Just, do you want to go ahead and just plug your channel real quick and kind of like what you do, so that way people know what you do, and if people want to follow you there, they can.
Sure. Yeah, so as you say, I kind of work under the moniker Alleyway Jack. And yeah, my channel generally focuses on doing game discourses, which are lengthy discussions, kind of picking apart games, looking at theories, historical analogs to certain games. And I generally focus on RPGs, and particularly Final Fantasy, because, they've as with you guys, they're games that have always kind of struck me as quite profound and excellent narratives, fantasy narratives to explore. So yeah, that's pretty much what I do. And yeah, you can check me out at youtube.com/alleywayjack.
Yeah, very good stuff. You guys should check it out. I mean, if you don't have the time to replay some of these games, just listening to somebody kind of just provide their detailed analysis of the games really kind of brings you back to the game, almost as if you are playing it again, but just within an hour or two. So it's really good stuff. So really enjoy it. All right, gents, let's move on to this Final Fantasy 16 content. So as we all know, there was a reveal of Final Fantasy 16 at the PS5 showcase. We gave some kind of off the cuff reveal reactions on our channel, where it was just literally 2 hours after the trailer came out, and we didn't really have a lot of the information, but we just kind of, hey, we saw the trailer. This is what we thought initially, and we were going to follow up a little bit on stuff after we had time to sit with it. But yeah, it was clearly a very exciting announcement that came out. And on the follow-up of that, Yoshi P, the director, the producer, he came out and said that the trailer was not going to have another trailer until 2021, and that we shouldn't expect any additional information regarding that. And there's been just kind of camps showing up with Final Fantasy, where you're in one camp where you really like the trailer for Final Fantasy 16, you're really excited about it. Then there's the other camp that is just basically very dismissive of what they saw. They did not like it at all. And it's kind of, there's this rift that's appearing within the Final Fantasy community. And it's kind of weird, because I could almost see it happening, right? Once the trailer happened, there was this kind of like 3-hour gap where people just didn't really know how to feel about it. What's the correct opinion to have? Is what I'm feeling accurate, right? And then within a couple of days, you start seeing people getting very, one side or the other. And I think I've gotten to the place where I'm mostly in the middle on this. But to just give some context here before we start off, because I do want to get Jack's opinion on the trailer. But there has been some additional news that's come out, small news but relevant. And the first thing is that there was a provisional rating for the game of 18. So it's PEGI 18 provisional, and that implies that there is a game that can be reviewed, right? A version of it anyways. It's a provisional rating. I mean, Tales of Arise had the same rating too, and that game's not coming out for God knows how long, but looks like it's going to be an M rating. And then we also had a panel with Yoshi P at the Tokyo Game Show, where he commented on some of the reaction to the trailer and just said that basically they wanted to show in-game scenes, unlike prior Final Fantasies where it was, Versus 13, it was this CG trailer with no gameplay. Or with Final Fantasy 13, they actually showed a trailer where they rendered what looked like gameplay, but it wasn't actual gameplay. So he didn't want to do that this time. He wanted to start off on a good foot and show actual gameplay. And in addition to that, he also said that we're going to find out more about the characters and like the world on the website. There's going to be a website that has more information late October this year, which is kind of conflicting with what he said before, but that's very exciting. And that he also promised that the 2021 trailer would be much more polished. So Yoshi P's kind of tackling some of these criticisms head on, but yeah, it's very exciting. Very cool stuff. So Jack, I'm just curious, what did you think about this Final Fantasy 16 trailer that was revealed? Did you where are you sitting with it?
So my policy with Final Fantasy is generally cautious optimism until I can be proved otherwise. And, as you've already touched on, there are discrepancies. Sometimes Final Fantasies can feel like a letdown, perhaps how we say. But yeah, I'm going for cautious optimism with this. I think what we've seen, one of the terms I've seen touted around is this sort of return to the roots of what Final Fantasy is, which, depending on your generation, is kind of hard to know what people mean with that. But I think, going back to the first few games, we have this very kind of Tolkien-esque knights and mages sort of game. And that was, immediately it's obvious that Final Fantasy 16 is sort of kind of returning to this. I actually thought of the Ivalice games as well. I had seen some, rumors go on constantly about there being a new Final Fantasy game. And there is an article floating around where someone was proposing or theorizing that it was going to be a return to Ivalice. And then when I actually started watching the trailer, I was like, "Whoa, could that be true?" I don't know, because it had this sort of Ivalice vibe about it.
Right.
But I watched it a few times, and yeah, I'm going for optimism. I quite like it. And some of the things you touched on actually in your trailer breakdown, I kind of took away from it as well. There seems to be, with the tattoos and the markings and things, there's these kind of tribes of people almost, and these allegiances, and it seems quite politicized, where perhaps earlier games, thinking of 10 just out of the blue, have a sort of romantic element to them. That seems to be a trend in a lot of, even if it's a major plot line like in Final Fantasy VIII or a minor one, there tends to be a sort of romantic inclination. There was none of that in this trailer. It was very political. It was very violent. It was like a cross between the Spartan 300 and Game of Thrones almost. Yeah. And I think that could go either way. I think it could be actually quite a refreshing change for the series. So yeah, that was my take on it.
Yeah, I think that initially, if you go back and look at our just kind of reveal thoughts, literally right after the trailer dropped, I have to be honest, I was a little underwhelmed with what we had there. I didn't know what to think, because I think that it was just not a good trailer to showcase the game, because I think most people were just kind of confused what this was, right? And now that I've actually gone through it more, I'm much more optimistic. But I think that initially, the game starts off with what appears to be Final Fantasy 14, to me anyways, a type aesthetic. So some people thought it was 14, but then you saw an axe go through somebody's head and blood flying across the screen. You're like, oh, okay, maybe it's not. But then you see chocobos and you're just like, well, is this Final Fantasy 14? And then, but it looks better than Final Fantasy 14. What is this? Right. And then you're seeing blood fly across a toddler's face, and you're just, you don't know what it is. And then it's like Final Fantasy 16. Right. And we didn't learn the main character's name. We didn't learn the name of the locations or anything like that. And I think that the way the trailer was constructed was just kind of trying to set the tone that this is going to be a new direction for the series. And now that I've gone through it, I actually kind of like what we've seen. But initially it was kind of shocking. And I wonder if they had taken the route of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trailer that was released in May last year, I believe it was, where it was the state of play. It was the first trailer for 7 Remake in 3 years that appeared, where it was basically a minute and a half long. And it was basically just a recreation of Final Fantasy VII events, right? They're trying to get the fan base on board and show them no, it's the same game. It's mostly the same. We're still recreating these events. Look at Cloud. Aerith's giving him the flower, there's all these different events that are similar enemies. And while this isn't a remake, I wonder if they had taken that route with the trailer and just maybe not started off in the first 8 seconds with an axe through some guy's head. Like maybe show a Moogle or something, or an airship, or something more fun. I guess technically they did show Shiva and Titan and all that, but I think that for certain people, like there wasn't enough information in the trailer for people to really say what this is, right? And then it's in a new direction too, so I think that was kind of a recipe for some people to just opt out early. Now, I think that people that are opting out early are...
It's too soon. Yeah, come on.
Yeah, because once they show another trailer in 2021, I imagine a lot of people are going to jump back in. But I've gotten a lot more optimistic about this. I'm kind of more in the route that you're looking at this, Jack, because while it's a new direction, my initial concern was that this was just a further attempt to appeal to the West and just an abandonment of what Final Fantasy was, because it seemed more Western with like a Witcher vibe.
And that's a really good point, actually, because one thing I've noticed, and I think it may have been Yoshinori Kitase, one of the kind of big guys at Square, has actually outrightly stated, they've wanted to broaden their appeal to a Western audience. Okay, so where the early games had a Western vibe about them because they were inspired, as I say, by this Tolkien-esque Dungeons and Dragons sort of fantasy, they were still overtly Japanese in delivery in terms of story, and they had all this wacky, kooky stuff going on. They were very Japanese games, and I would say there's been it's debatable where you could say this transition's taken place. Some people say Final Fantasy X was this overt step towards appealing to the West, in some respects. But I'd still class that as a kind of Japanese story. But for example, Final Fantasy 15, one of the major concept artists they brought in was Roberto Ferrari, who's an Italian guy. It wasn't Tetsuya Nomura or any of these Japanese dudes doing this anymore. They are trying to adopt a Western aesthetic and perhaps a Western sort of story and the way they construct things and stuff, which and that's where I sort of get concerned, because there's and I don't want to sound like someone that's like, oh, Final Fantasy 7, Final Fantasy 8 are the best. I'm not militant like that at all. But I think I'm concerned that Final Fantasy is its own thing, and if it were to become homogenized with something like The Witcher, that's where, just to try and get new audiences and the stuff, that's, I think it could lose the essence of what it was. Yeah, what it was. Yeah.
I do agree that I think that the fan base like us, that I don't know if you came into Final Fantasy during the PlayStation era. Is that where you first?
Yeah. I mean, Final Fantasy 7 was the first one I played.
Yeah, me too.
When I was really young. And then 8, 9, 10. They released 6 on the PlayStation 1. So that was sort of like my stomping ground for Final Fantasy. And one thing I've always found, it's a generalization, but I think your first experience of Final Fantasy is sort of where you set the bar almost.
Right.
I know there's people that are a few years younger than me, where Final Fantasy X was their first Final Fantasy game, and of course, it's PS2. You had the voice acting, different dynamics, slightly more linear, and that was where they set the standard for Final Fantasy, and that's their idea and their memory of the game. So I think that there's an element of that around people's opinions as well, generationally.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of accuracy with what you're saying there, because people do have this kind of inherent belief of what Final Fantasy is. And I think that, like you brought up at the start with Final Fantasy X, every new game seemed to just remove something small from what it was before, right? So Final Fantasy X, we lost the airship. Final Fantasy XI was an online game. Final Fantasy 12, people were upset about the combat, that, it's not turn-based. 13, we lost towns and NPCs, and then 15 just went full open world and action combat. and you had to pay $5 to find out why Ignis went blind. It's a total new direction, right? So I think that some of the older fans that look at this trailer were being a little bit more pessimistic maybe about what we're seeing, because it just seems like initially this is a further detour down the path of, removing something else, such as party members or, something like that. And that's kind of the route I was looking at this initially. But I think that now that I've looked at this closer, I really do think that given Yoshi P's obsession with Game of Thrones, that, and the fact that this is an M-rated game, right? If they were concerned about sales, they would make this teen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, true.
I think this is just them letting Yoshi P do what he wants. And I think that it just happens to be his brand of Final Fantasy. I mean, we saw this in the past. Who was directing the Final Fantasy, you would have a different flavor, right? Final Fantasy VIII has a different flavor than Final Fantasy IX. And so this is Yoshi P's take on Final Fantasy, and it's got blood in it. I mean, it's going to be M-rated. It's very Game of Thrones. He likes that type of thing. And I think that it's not a coincidence that influence is in there. And when I look at it through that lens, I'm thinking, okay, well, it's different. It's a new take, but at least he's passionate about it. At least we're having somebody execute something that they want. Final Fantasy 15, we had Tabata, who was trying to execute Nomura's vision, At least we have somebody that's from the ground working on something that is what they want to do. And I think that goes back to the Sakaguchi approach of, hey, are you passionate about this? Okay, we should do that. That's how games like Xenogears, Final Fantasy Tactics, those games got off the ground, because he saw that people were passionate about those ideas, and they seemed like, they were going to put a lot of heart into what they were making. So I think from that perspective, I have gotten a little bit more optimistic. But Stan, we've been going back and forth, and you've been kind of quiet over there. But did you want to interject?
Yeah, I'm pretty much in the middle with you still. It's funny. I think I started off more positive, and then I came down towards the middle, because when I first saw the trailer, I guess the biggest gripe I had at first was the combat system, how it's kind of going more towards a full action style, and they even have one of the guys from Devil May Cry series is now Square Enix poached him from Capcom, and now he's working on this Final Fantasy 16 for them. And yeah, the combat looks very Devil May Cry like, and I'm not sure I like that. Of course, I have to try it or see how it turns out before I can judge it fully. But just from an initial reaction, I was like, I kind of want my Final Fantasy games to play like more traditional Final Fantasy. Now, I know that they're never going to go back to fully turn-based, because like you guys have mentioned, they have this goal to appeal to a Western audience, and they've determined that Final Fantasy X, 9, 8's combat system is not going to get them the 5 to 10 million copies sold that they need for their flagship franchise, So
that would be quite the PS5 reveal if the opening PS5 reveal trailer had some dude just standing there, like waiting for somebody to attack him.
Yeah. But I can see myself getting on board with an action combat system, depending on what it does and how it works. But the thing that gives me pause, and we don't have confirmation about this, maybe we'll learn more next month when the website comes online, is the lack of party members that were in the trailer. So it appeared to be like a solo character combat system, at least from what was shown. And I know Jack did a video probably a couple years ago at this point about called "What is Final Fantasy?" And one of the core points of that video was the party members, like kind of like the Fellowship, like in Fellowship of the Ring, right? You have a group of people come together for a common goal, and then they kind of travel the world, after to thwart a villain or to acquire some legendary item that they need. That's kind of like, that's even in more of the modern Final Fantasies, like 13 and 15. They still have this element of like people coming together like for a common cause. And if it's more of a like a solo character driven story, which Revenge seems to be like the kind of the plot thread they're going for, at least with the main character, I don't know if I can get on board with that. Like, you still need the element of like, a group of people, because that's really what a lot of people associate with a JRPG versus a Western style RPG. Is Western style RPGs are often like The Witcher, right? And it's about this character. You're role playing this one character, or various other games like the Fallout series, right? It's often like not party based. It's like a single character. But Japanese RPGs, like traditional Final Fantasy games or like the Tales of franchise, it's about like a group of people, and like you get their mix of personalities, and they're off going on a quest all together. So that's probably my biggest concern still, which might be very outdated in a month or so when if they reveal that there are in fact party members and new party-based combat. So
it'll be interesting to see, I think, because it's interesting. One of the big criticisms, Final Fantasy VIII is a game that I hold in quite high regard, but one of the consistent criticisms of Final Fantasy VIII is the fact that all your party members are acquired quite early, and you're all from the same place. For the most part, you're seeds from Garden, and everyone's and people tend to gravitate towards these eclectic mixes of people that you meet along the way, as you've said. Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy X, most games follow in that. But another thing you've touched on, which is interesting, is the revenge thing. You have this protagonist. It seems like, as you said, it seems like, we're not sure, but at the end of that trailer, it seems like the protagonist is seeking revenge, which I think is also an interesting take for a Final Fantasy game, because quite often the protagonists are sort of incidental. They sort of stumble into events, and there's a degree of fatedness, but they don't set out specifically for revenge. Tidus falling into Spira, for example, and he sort of fumbles his way through. Noctis's dad is murdered, and then suddenly he's found. He has to go and do this stuff, and Cloud and Squall are both mercenaries, and mercenaries by their nature are detached. They go into a situation to do a job. It's not like Cloud is impassioned like Avalanche are. He's doing a job for Avalanche, but he doesn't care about Avalanche. And that's what tends to make protagonists in Final Fantasy games quite interesting. Traditionally, they we figure them out, and they figure themselves out, and they develop a raison d'etre, during the story, rather than saying, okay, revenge, and then being driven by quite a strong sort of thread like that. So,
I guess,
yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that I think that's accurate, but I would point to Final Fantasy 12, right? And it's almost a Final Fantasy 12 type story, because we had Ash in that game, where that was kind of her character arc, that she wanted to take revenge. And at some point she has to decide, is my personal vengeance worth the deaths of all these people? Is this the right type of thing to do? So it is an unusual approach to take with a Final Fantasy, for sure. It's definitely not the daddy issues of Final Fantasy X.
We know that Yoshi P is a big fan of Matsuno, and Matsuno is the one who created Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy 12. So, and also Vagrant Story, which we know that, well, we don't know for sure, but it seems that Joshua is like a reference to Vagrant Story. It's probably not enough to say that for sure this happens in the Evil East world, but it looks like a reference. And then I wonder if that revenge plot is kind of something he admired in Final Fantasy 12, and so he wants to take that into account for this story as well. Because I've heard in the past that like the whole reason that he joined the company was so that he could work with Matsuno. Like he wanted to work with him, and he eventually got that wish on some of the Final Fantasy 14 DLC. But then Matsuno tweeted that he's not in any way involved in Final Fantasy 16.
So did
Because I
Yoshi
think
P.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah.
Yoshi
That's
P
true.
also denied working on the game.
Yeah, that's true. I think Matsuno, though, at this stage of his career, is just kind of contracted with them for like special projects. He came
Right.
back for the PSP remaster of Tactics Ogre, and then he also worked with them on Final Fantasy 14. But I don't think at this stage he wants to work on any multi-year, like very long project, like directing or producing a game. I don't think he's not really looking to return to that role. So, but it is interesting because I think it does have a lot of Final Fantasy Tactics vibes to it, kind of Evil East vibes to the game. I was telling Hat before we started, a lot of people are not pleased with the aesthetic of the game because they say it looks too Western, like too similar to like a Witcher or like even a Dragon's Dogma type of game. But then I was telling Hat, if they did a remake of Final Fantasy Tactics, like a full remake, this is what it would look like.
Absolutely.
Maybe minus some of the blood and the mature content, but
I don't know. I mean,
in terms of the aesthetic, like this is what a remake of Final Fantasy Tactics would
absolutely
look like.
Yeah. And I think again that's another criticism. So one of my friends immediately, like the knee-jerk sort of initial reactions to the trailer, she said, "I'm not convinced." And I know for a fact her favorite game is Final Fantasy X. And I think, it's the aesthetic of that game, and you have these vibrant colors, and you have characters like Kimari, for example. And we haven't seen from the trailer, much of the non-human characters, if indeed there are many or any. So, as you say, it's kind of this sort of figurative realism that Final Fantasies have consistently gone towards, where now it's very realistic and it's very medieval. It's kind of rooted almost in a sort of tangible reality. It just happens to have icons and chocobos in it. So
I think that people often forget though how mature Final Fantasy used to be, because I mean Final Fantasy VII had elements of bestiality in it, right?
Yeah,
which is very wild, by the way. And then there was the Trail of Blood, which was very gruesome. And then Final Fantasy Tactics, my God, there is so many questions of who slept with who and whose child is who, and just, very, very dark game. And so I think that Final Fantasy has gone this route before with some of the more mature subjects and some of the mature themes. But I think, Jack, you're right that, it depends on where you come in with the series that kind of defines what a Final Fantasy looks like to you. Because if you did come in with Final Fantasy X, there's no bestiality in Final Fantasy X. I mean, 10-2, you kind of have the cousin thing going on with brother, which is a little weird. But I think that's just more of a cultural difference, I would imagine. But this I think stands right that if Final Fantasy Tactics was remade in PlayStation or current gen graphics, whether it's PS4, PS5, that it would, I don't know if it would look exactly like this, but I do think it would look somewhat similar to what we have here, at least from a tone perspective. I think that tonally it would be kind of more this route. But what do you guys think about the criticism that, I don't want to say criticism, but just the opinion that people have about the aesthetic looking to Game of Thrones? Because I like Game of Thrones. And so that wasn't like a particular turnoff for me. And I mean, Final Fantasy has long had an obsession with Star Wars. And there's been lots of games that looked very similar to Star Wars with some certain elements, right? So is the to Game of Thrones aesthetic, does that resonate with you guys, or what do you think about that? Or do you just disagree with that entirely?
Well, as someone who
doesn't watch Game of Thrones,
has not watched Game of Thrones, I can't say it bothers
so
me
Game of Thrones might look too like Final Fantasy 16.
Yeah.
once you watch it.
I was waiting kind of for Game of Thrones to be finished because I don't
Mhm.
like to be left waiting every week, right? Just to get more and more. I used to, because that's the way TV used to work, but now so much stuff is on demand, that you can binge a lot of content. So I was waiting to just binge Game of Thrones someday. However, from what I understand, it didn't end as well as people had hoped. Maybe it didn't maintain its quality from beginning to end.
It's worth
So now
watching.
so I'll still watch it someday, but it's just no longer a huge priority. But anyway, regarding Final Fantasy 16, yeah, I guess I can't say I'm too bothered by that kind of criticism. I mean, it's going for a fantasy style, and
Well, people
I think maybe Game of Thrones is just the most recent thing. Like, imagine if they made a fantasy Final Fantasy game right on the heels of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, right?
Mhm.
People might be saying like, "Oh, it looks too similar to Lord of the Rings," or something. It's just kind of like been the most recent big fantasy story that most people are familiar with. So I think that's probably more where the criticism is coming from.
Well, to kind of unpack this point of view, I think that what people are looking at is they're looking at the main character when he's younger. It appears that he's of royal blood, but he's still bowing to is either the queen or people have thought that perhaps he's a bastard. And if that's the case, I mean, it seems like our main character is going down this Jon Snow type character arc. Yeah. And Yoshi P has talked about Game of Thrones. Some of the scenes where they're in the courtyard look kind of Game of Thrones-ish, but in some of the, inside dungeons where there's people sitting at tables and talking politics and stuff, it seems very Game of Thrones-y, but I like Game of Thrones. That doesn't bother me at all. I think Game of Thrones is good. So I don't.
I think that's it, and there are, I said this, I can't remember who I was talking about. It was a while back. It was the idea of a stereotype or something kind of being a facsimile of something else. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, whether it's, because Game of Thrones itself is based on real world history, and I think, so even if it is deeply inspired by Game of Thrones and it adopts things like houses and, different allegiances based on, blood or geography or whatever, I don't think it necessarily makes it has the potential to go either way still. And like you, I really like Game of Thrones. I like politics. I like warring families and all this stuff. I'm reading a book now about the history of Scotland, and it's full of that sort of stuff. It's pure Game of Thrones. So I'm quite excited to see a Final Fantasy that sort of draws on that. And as you mentioned earlier, Stan, Final Fantasy Tactics is deeply political. Hinges almost exclusively on politics, and it's only right at the very end you kind of you get the supernatural end boss, which is standard fare, but it's mainly based on houses and families and stuff like that, which I think is really interesting. I'm kind of keen.
One element of this that I do think I'm excited about is there's this comparison to the Matsuno work, and I think that's there for sure with just the maturity of the subjects and the medieval setting. But I'm so happy that the game just does not have the overly flowery dialogue. I think that some of it's really well written, but sometimes it's just needlessly flowery, and that just doesn't get me excited, because when I play Final Fantasy 12, for example, there's scenes in which it almost feels unnatural, like people wouldn't actually talk like that. And I think it kind of misdirects from the purpose of having clarity with dialogue. For example, this was a couple years ago. I was doing a stream with Mike from the Resident Arc channel, and he was doing Final Fantasy 12. And for the first time, he was playing it, and I was kind of there guiding him along with the game. And there's this scene where Vaughn is talking to Bosch, and Vaughn's like finally exploding and telling him all these things that he believes Bosch did. You did this, you did that, you did this, you did that. And then Bosch looks at Vaughn and says, "That's not the way of it, I promise you." And I remember Mike was sitting there and he said, "The dialogue in this game is so good." And I thought, well, no, that's just a very confusing way to say that. Like, I don't know anybody that would say it like that. I'll have to stop. Like, what? Oh, okay. Oh, it was not the way of it. I promise you. I would have just said, no, that's not true. That's not what happened. So I strongly prefer good dialogue, but more grounded dialogue. And from what we've seen in this game, it's a little bit more straightforward. So I'm happy that they're taking the elements from Matsuno work that I like, but they're not going with a total commitment to that type of dialogue.
We'll have to see. There wasn't a ton of dialogue in the trailer, right? So, I mean, I guess there was a fair amount, but you never know until you actually...
The Shiva's dominant guy. I don't know. I went through the trailer frame by frame, so I guess maybe in my mind it's more has a lot
clear.
more than But
yeah,
how did you guys feel about some of the people feeling that this is just yet another Fabula Nova Crystallis story? Right? There's the belief that this is going back to the roots. We're dealing with the crystals, and then there's the other group of people that are like, this isn't a new story. This is Final Fantasy 15 again, where every nation has a crystal or can summon icons, and, Final Fantasy 13 with the crystals and the gods, and Final Fantasy 12 with the crystals and the Nethicite and the gods. And, it's kind of a just a further expansion of the same thing. Does that resonate with you guys? Or do you feel like this is just kind of, is this uniquely a new thing from what you've been able to see?
So for my part, I think crystals are they're a legacy element of Final Fantasy in the same way that a character called Cid is, in the same way that chocobos are. Now, those things tend to feature in most Final Fantasy games, but they've always been utilized in uniquely different ways, in quite interesting ways. So I'm willing to hold judgment on that. At the moment, in the trailer, you hear people talking about Imperials and that sort of thing. Imperials against sort of an insurrection or rebels. It's an ongoing, and again, as you say, Star Wars influence. It's this sort of homage that's consistently used in Final Fantasy, but almost always it's done to a unique and really interesting, degree. That's my take on it.
Yeah. Stan?
Yeah. The initially when the trailer came out with there was like I don't know what you call it, a phrase or like that was a tagline in the trailer that said the legacy of the crystals has shaped our history for long enough. And on our initial reactions podcast that we did, I thought that maybe that was like a meta message that this is telling you that the legacy of the crystals was, that was the old Final Fantasy, but it's saying for long enough, so now it's moving in its own direction. But I think that was maybe me just looking into things.
No, I took that. I took that.
Oh,
as
you
well.
did? Okay.
I immediately thought something like that. They're playing around with that. Maybe this game's going to see crystals destroyed, and then that's it. Every future Final Fantasy is going to lose the crystals.
I'm wondering if maybe, because I think that's the main character's voice speaking. I'm wondering if he is like. It looks like there's some kind of traumatic event that happens to him and Joshua, and then I wonder if that is kind of the inciting incident that makes him decide the crystals and the icons, like they all need to go away, like the world would be better off without them, and then that's kind of his goal. And so I wonder if because it looks like he's able to acquire the power of the summons, like we see him in combat with like the Phoenix Wing, and then also like Titan's fists, as he's like able to. So I wonder if he's like on a personal quest to like destroy all the icons and maybe the crystals as well, so that like the world can exist without their kind of supernatural power like overshadowing everything. That gives it kind of a Final Fantasy 12 vibe as well, with like the Nethicite and like the Ocuria, and they're like using these powerful crystals to kind of dictate like
and Final Fantasy 13 too, that the gods are controlling everyone's fate, and that if we could just get rid of them, that people could finally have personal agency in their own lives, right?
Yeah. So it's weird, like the meta message I read into it and like what it could be in the plot are almost like opposed, right? Because like Hat's saying, like if it turns out to be like a plot related type of thing of we have to rid the world of the crystals, well then that's actually something that's been done before. But if it's like the meta message, then it would be different. It would be trying to say like we're actually breaking away from kind of the tradition of Final Fantasy. So I'm not sure which it is. I guess we'll have to wait and kind of see the next trailer or more information coming out to try and gauge that.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. It's just the issue I had was basically what you outlined, Stan, and then also I was like, are they really going to come out with their first trailer with kind of like a middle finger to the fan base? You know, like, we're doing like this is going away completely, right? And then there's the idea that like the Final Fantasy series at its pinnacle, which I think was the PlayStation, those games only like loosely had stuff to do with crystals. It wasn't as crystal focused. There was definitely a crystal element in the lore, but you know, it wasn't like 15 where Luna's talking about the crystal all the time, or, you know, Noctis has to go find the crystal. This wasn't a core element of the game. It was just kind of lore based. With Final Fantasy VII, the materia was involved with crystals, right? It wasn't like Cloud had to track down all the crystals or anything like that. So it would seem weird to me if they were like the legacy, because kind of what people really look at Final Fantasy as has very little to do with the crystals. So I kind of thought like it sounded like a good line. And if they were going to go in a new direction, I think that they would just do like what they did. They would just come out with the trailer, new direction, axe in guy's head. People like it. People buy it, you know, and it was successful. And they just say, hey, Final Fantasy 16 sold 12 million copies. Next game's going to be M-rated and we're going to go the same direction. You know, I don't know if they would really do that, especially since the last decade or so, there's been a Final Fantasy committee that was formed at Square Enix. And this was basically in reaction to basically the Final Fantasy 13. There was a complete backlash to that game. And then the follow-up with that, Final Fantasy 14, initially when it came out, it was a complete disaster, as we all know, and they had to remake it. So at that point, Square Enix said, okay, something's wrong. We need to address this. And they formed this committee of just producers and former directors of Final Fantasy. And we had people on there like Katase and Yoshi P. Tabata was on there for some reason, Toriyama. And they would just review everything to do with Final Fantasy to make sure that it is of quality and that it's not going to tarnish the image. So they describe things like if Cloud appears in a commercial, they want to make sure that Cloud's not like, you know, selling crack or something, like, right? He's not like in a Breaking Bad commercial, you know, like that he's doing something that's in keeping with his character. But also for newer games, they're reviewing that to make sure that the game is still recognizable as Final Fantasy and still of good quality. So they could avoid some of the issues they had with 13, with all the, you know, development problems and lack of focus with that development for that game. And then also with 14, with just some of the bad ideas that were implemented with the game. So I would have to think that if they were planning on doing that middle finger to the fan base in the trailer, I would think the Final Fantasy committee would look at that and be like, are you sure? It seems like this seems like the whole reason we were formed for you not to do this. Right. And so that's kind of what I think about it, especially if you look at some of the Japanese translation of that. It's a little bit different, but I definitely think fans are going to read into that sentence and say, that's definitely what it is. That's definitely what it is, you know? So, what do you guys think about like the timeline for this game? You know, initially when this trailer was announced, I say initially, like it happened a long time ago, last week, you know, when this trailer came out, I was kind of apprehensive about it because it was 4 minutes long. And I thought, oh my goodness, Square's doing this again. They're showing us this trailer and it's, you know, it's not even PlayStation 5 footage. It's PC footage. It's the only game at the PlayStation 5 showcase that doesn't have PlayStation 5 footage. And it seems like they would have PlayStation 5 footage. If they could show it, they would, right? So apparently it wasn't ready. So I thought, why are you showing so much footage for a game that doesn't even have a PlayStation 5 version to show, and that this game is not coming out for a long time, but it seems like it might come out sooner? So I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Do you think that the timeline, obviously we don't know, we're just speculating, but what's y'all's gut feeling with the timeline for this, and any other thoughts regarding that? Jack, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I would say this is where my caution comes in with my cautious optimism.
Yeah.
And a lot of discussions I've had, with friends, and a lot of opinions online do hinge around this sort of premature announcements that Square have sort of been known to do, and then it's almost like they're sort of playing catch up at the expense, some would argue, of the story and the cohesiveness of the plot, which. Again, you mentioned my What is Final Fantasy episode I did ages ago, but one of the things that I personally hold in high regard with the Final Fantasy games is these stories, these wonderful fantasy stories that we have. So yeah, when they announce something and it perhaps comes at the expense of that, that's where I start getting worried. And we find they need to plug all these leaks with DLC content or whatever. Not commenting on any specific game, but
the only one with the story DLC. Very easy to figure out. Yeah, that was honestly just, I think one of my biggest criticisms was stop announcing these games so early, because it's just shooting them in the foot. I mean, if you go back and look at some of the development history for the classic Final Fantasies that we talk about, right? The ones on the PlayStation, they were changing those stories up to like the very last minute a lot of times, with just certain scenes and how they were executed, and just really had freedom to, change the core concept. And if you look at some of the early ideas for what Final Fantasy was before we got the final product, it was drastically different. If you look at Final Fantasy X, for example, Yuna was originally supposed to look like she was supposed to wear this long crown thing, and it was like almost Star Wars-ish, right? And I think Kamari was like a lizard, and it's just, in Final Fantasy IX, Zidane and Dagger were both supposed to be dragoons, and that was the initial concept, right? So imagine if these games had shown a trailer at that state, they would have had to been committed to that idea. And so when I look at what they've done in the past, where they're showing, 13 way early, they're showing 15, 10 years early, they're showing 7 remake, they ended up having to redo that entire thing. But I thought, God, you're doing this again. You're doing a 4-minute trailer, and you're gonna regret this immediately, because people are gonna be like, where's the dog? I saw the dog in the trailer. How come this game doesn't have a dog? Or who's this guy, the Shiva's dominant? Where's this guy? What's his name? How come you removed him from the game? And then they'll try to install an entire backstory for him, and he doesn't even need to be in the game anymore. And so that was honestly my biggest concern with this. And I think it's my biggest current concern is, please do not do that. Please do not do that. And, it seems like Yoshi P is really taking this head on and trying to be a little bit more efficient about that. So I'm optimistic. But Stan, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I agree. Like, it is a concern. I guess I'm a little more optimistic about that, though, because of who's in charge. Like, Yoshi P is the producer, and I don't play Final Fantasy XIV anymore. I did when the Realm Reborn re-release of the game came out, but from what I understand, listening to people who play and enjoy that game, like, there's a steady stream of content and updates, and everything is like really on a nice schedule. Like, Yoshi, he keeps his people on schedule, essentially, right? And so I would hope that him and his team would never come into a situation where they were forced to cut content, right? I would hope that I'm thinking that maybe he has like a roadmap for the development that's like very solid, and that that hopefully won't be an issue. But yeah, like with Final Fantasy 13, like it was initially revealed with an early trailer that looked like gameplay but wasn't actually gameplay. And so of course when the game comes out, the gameplay looks nothing like that. And with Final Fantasy 15, which was versus 13 initially, you know, some of the concepts from that trailer like were retained in the game, like kind of the warp striking stuff, you know, like they stuck with that and kept it in. But then some of the later trailers, like the King Regis trailer and stuff like that, that scene, the entire scene just isn't in the game, but it was a trailer for some reason, you know. And yeah, like I can see why it's an issue, because the last two single player entries in the franchise have had these development issues where
3
they
really,
kind
if
of-
you include 7 remake.
That's true. Yeah, like the trailer they make is just concepts. They put concepts in the trailers, and then you know, yeah, like you said, they're kind of committed to like implementing those concepts into the gameplay and into the game. And then when things change, like they can't. And then rather than, because of deadlines, and I'm sure because of like also like voice acting, like and motion capture and stuff is expensive. So like if they have to, back in the SNES and the PS1 days, if they needed to redo the story content, well, like maybe you needed an artist, you know, to like redo a character model or something at the last minute. But now, like with voice acting and stuff, like you can't really call those people back into the studio a lot of the time. So like story content just ends up being cut altogether.
Especially
You know,
when these
so-
games are in like 30 languages and they're trying to have a worldwide release at the same time. I mean, that's, if you
Yeah.
want to make a story change and that stuff's already been recorded and rendered, that's a lot of people you got to bring back in. That's going to be expensive and time consuming.
There was a criticism with like Ravis's character in Final Fantasy 15, and sure enough, they like added some new scenes with him. But yeah, in order to do that, they had to get all the voice actors to come back and like re-record his lines or new lines specifically. So that's not something though that they would delay the game for. They're just going to cut the scenes, and then if there's a criticism after the fact, they're like, okay, yeah, we should add those back in.
Yeah.
You know, but
yeah, I think Ravis is a great example of that as well, because he was one of those characters that you see just purely from an aesthetic perspective. You know, I thought that guy is so cool, and then you play the mainline game, and I was like, okay, still not sure why you're angry. But then I watched the movie, you know, and it's this supplementary content. I'm like, okay, now I sort of understand Ravis, but it took, you know, deviating from the core game to really get that.
Yeah. So let me ask you guys, you know, we all we have is this first trailer, so we're doing some speculation here. I know that, you know, that's all it is, but let's come up with a scenario here where this game it comes out, it's a one player or single player game. It has one character, doesn't have a party, has the Devil May Cry type combat that we saw in the trailer, but it has a good story, good music. How does that sit with you? Is this going to be a deal breaker for you all, or is this too much of a departure that you've lost that party-based story, that it's more of a one-person adventure? Is this going to be an issue for you all, or where does that sit?
Interesting question, controversial question. I think, you know, I think there's an interesting idea about where you draw the line. When is it a numerical Final Fantasy, and when is it a Final Fantasy Tactics, for example? You know, Final Fantasy something else. Just based on what you've said, single player, you know, running around action based, I think giving that a numerical designation, off the top of my head, not sure.
You'd have to play. Sure. You'd have to play it, but you're uneasy about the idea. Yeah.
You know, like kind of Vagrant is, because what you're describing sounds almost like Vagrant Story. You know, so it could be Final Fantasy something else. You know.
Yeah.
16, not sure.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, I agree. Mentioned before, it's kind of, that's where it feels like you're losing something for sure. Like if you change the battle system from turn-based to non-turn-based to appeal to a wider audience, you know, and that's kind of, they experimented with that, like Final Fantasy 12 and then 13. They were turn-based, but also had real-time elements. and then they went with 15. It's like fully action. Essentially, there's like very little turn-based elements in that game. But then, like, if you take away the party members, then it's like we've almost like it's almost like Final Fantasy, the Western RPG version, right? That's what it would feel like.
And I think with the numerical games as well, generally, not always, but generally, a release with core gameplay changes and things like that is almost a blueprint for what comes next. You know, so for example, Final Fantasy 15, very action orientated. Then Final Fantasy 7 remake, you know, as much so, if not more so. You know, so we see this kind of chronology with how the games change over time. So if Final Fantasy 16 were to be, you know, one party member, very action centric, what does that mean for the future of the series, you know, at large?
And I think there's kind of an uneasiness among not just Final Fantasy fans, but JRPG fans to see kind of the flagship JRPG franchise become less and less like a traditional Japanese RPG. I think that's really what the core criticism comes down to, I guess, because it could be an awesome action style combat game. You know, it could just nail it. It could be as good as Devil May Cry 5, you know, and people really praise that game and love that game. But there's like genre distinctions for a reason, and like people want to come to Final Fantasy for a Final Fantasy experience. But if they come to that and get something else, you know, that's really where the criticism and the distaste for that type of change comes from. Yeah. So
I mean, if they wanted Devil May Cry, they'd buy Devil May Cry, you know.
Right. This has kind of put me, because I've been putting a lot of thought into this, and this has really put me in a kind of a weird spot, because, you know, I've said for years that what I would really love is maybe not a mainline Final Fantasy game, but a side Final Fantasy game that was basically Witcher 3 with chocobos. I don't know. I just wanted that mature Final Fantasy, and it's almost like when I saw this trailer, this was like 70% of what I asked for. And yet I kind of felt dumb, because I was kind of critical of it. And I was like, why am I being critical? Like, for the first time, Square's kind of doing something along the lines of what I wanted. And I think it comes back to what we're talking about here is just, are the changes too much? But then I was sitting there thinking about it. And I mean, it's not like Square's never done this before, right? When fans were on the Super Nintendo and they were really big fans of Final Fantasy 4 and 6 and all those great games, Final Fantasy 7 came out, and it was, you know, all of a sudden people are in skyscrapers and there's helicopters and, you know, there's motorcycles. And this was a very dramatic change from what they had before. And a lot of people were very upset about it. A lot of people felt like this was just an attempt to commercialize more. You know, it's gone 3D and it's got these cutscenes, and it's not the pixel art graphics like it was before, and it's not medieval like it was before. And the heart of Final Fantasy's completely been torn apart, right? And over time, people ended up liking it. So it's kind of made me think about this from a different point of view, that, you know, over time things change. And while I won't be happy if we lose party members, I mean, if the story's good, I think that eventually maybe this is just another time in Final Fantasy's history where things are just going to change. And if it's good, I think that I'm going to be able to appreciate it and like it. And I might just have to accept it for what it is. And that's what it is, right? I mean, I see people online that are still complaining about not having turn-based combat. And it's like, and stuff like that. I'm like, dude, that ship has sailed so long ago. Like, I'm not even wasting mental energy getting concerned about that, because it's just not going to happen, you know?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is whether you enjoy it. Of course, I've had the turn-based conversation with a few people, and, you know, I absolutely love the PS1 gen games. I love the turn-based thing, but, you know, fully appreciative that it's gone now. That's fine, you know. There's still plenty to take from the games. And actually, Final Fantasy VII Remake, I actually really loved the combat. It was one of the things I most enjoyed about it personally. I thought it was great fun. I had proposed in one of my episodes that maybe, as a sort of throwback gesture, that the battle square would be like a turn-based style battle square, like an arcade thing, like in the Gold Saucer. But that's sort of that's my idea for that is blown out of the water, because of course we had the Wall Market sort of, you know, battle square, and it's completely action orientated. But yeah, I thought it was cool.
That would be a great idea. I mean, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I mean, if they just had something where you could just do the same type of game, but with the you know, PS4 graphics or PS5 graphics with turn-based combat, that'd be a lot of fun. But just for like a event at the Gold Saucer, right? Play this arcade, and it's just, you know, with those old school battle systems, that would be a lot of fun for sure. But yeah, so back to Final Fantasy 16. I mean, I think we're kind of getting near the end here, but I think that I just want to say that I've kind of come to terms with this game. I think I'm going to give it a chance. I was initially very critical of the game. I was very concerned, but I think at this point that given Yoshi P's prior performance, right? He's been able to get Final Fantasy 14 completely rebuilt within 2 years. And that's during like I think they had a tsunami and stuff. Like, he had a lot of stuff to deal with, and he was able to get that game out. It's very beloved. And since then, those expansions have come out. People have talked about those expansions like they're the greatest thing Final Fantasy has ever done. So these are the same people working on 16. So I have to at least have that in the back of my mind, that I think the story is at least going to be enjoyable. And I'm kind of hopeful that the fact that Yoshi P wanted to do this type of game and Square's just letting him do it, right? And we're not having like a 12-year-old jerry rigged in there like Final Fantasy 12. Well, I guess Vaughn was 17, but whatever. Like, you know, there's not this Square's concerned, where's the younger character that's going to appeal to the audience. We need a Vaughn character in there for you know, our younger kids. You know, we have an adult character. We have an M-rated game. I mean, they're taking a lot of risks with this, and I think that's exciting. I mean, you know, with risk, there's the possibility that it might not pay off. It might not be good. It might be something that we don't really appreciate, but they are taking risks now with Final Fantasy. And I think that's for the best. I think that's allowing the creators to actually take a risk with these games and actually, you know, do something that they want to do, that they're passionate about, and that it's not oversaturated with just corporate concerns of, you know, do we have enough product placement in this? You know, where's the young character? Okay, you know, what's this demographic think? And just the art aesthetic too is, I know people don't like it, but I'm sorry, I think it's so much more better than, you know, Gladio walking around with his abs hanging out and you know, Cindy wearing a shirt that's 8 sizes too small. You know, it's just, I think that like they're finally making a Final Fantasy with like my demographic in mind, right? Whereas in the past, it's kind of felt like they had me in mind, but they're also trying to appeal to a younger audience. And it's just, I feel like I'm finally the target for this game. So I'm going to be optimistic about it. I don't like that they showed so much for this trailer. I still don't think this game's going to come out for a while, but I'm feeling good about it. So yeah, you guys have
absolutely. I think.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, do you have anything?
I would say generally that I agree with you there. I think, you know, you were talking about target audiences and stuff, and I think that's perhaps been an issue with Final Fantasies, you know, and Van is a brilliant example of that. It's like, you know, don't try and appeal to everyone because you're going to appeal to no one. You know, if you get like a kind of an auteur, someone that has a vision for the game, a vision for the narrative, you know, that can kind of push through with that, even if it's not what you initially expect, it does have the capacity to be brilliant, you know, because they're delivering on their vision. You know?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's where my optimism comes from. And, you know, Final Fantasies, again, going back to the turn-based thing we were just discussing, you know, that people do have these perceptions, generational or otherwise, about what Final Fantasy should be. But we should remember that this is a series that has constantly evolved and constantly reinvented itself. You know, Final Fantasy 1, yeah, it was knights and mages, but it also had robots in it. You know, these games are kind of they are strange and they're wonderful. And I think just, and yeah, I think allowing them to produce what they want, deliver on this vision, to see what they come up with. I'm quite enthusiastic about seeing what happens with it.
Yeah, I agree. Stan, anything to add?
I mean, I do want them to deliver on their vision. The only, like I've mentioned several times, the only thing I'm pessimistic about is like the party members. Like, I still want some kind of party-based combat and kind of like a group aspect feeling to the story, which could still be there. We've only seen one trailer, so I can't really pass judgment on that at this stage. But other than that, like, I'm down with the aesthetic of the game. Like, I think it looks good. I'm happy that it's like the story is allowed to get a mature rating, essentially, from like what they're trying to do with the game and the story. I wish that was also in Final Fantasy VII Remake, but for a certain scene in the Shinra building that didn't, play out the way it did in the original. But that's too bad. But I'm like, if they can have a mature rating on this game, and if it sells well despite that, maybe that will change the mind of the higher ups, like at Square Enix. Like, hey, maybe every Final Fantasy game doesn't have to have a teen rating, right? And that would just be good for the franchise moving forward, like, because then each director or producer can, and story writer can decide, like, hey, we want to do this with the story, and not worry like, oh, but we have to make it, acceptable for this audience, so kind of untie their hands, right? If moving forward Final Fantasy is allowed to be mature rated or not, like, that would be a good thing just all around, I think.
Yeah. And
the combat, like, I can get behind it if it's good, essentially. But I do want some kind of party based. I'm not such a purist that I have to have my turn-based combat back. That would be nice, but it's not going to happen. So I'm already kind of past that point. So,
yeah. Well, it's kind of an interesting dynamic we have, though, because people have pointed out that, okay, they're going this new direction with Final Fantasy 16. If there's no party members, it's just, we don't know that to be sure, but let's say that is the case, worst case scenario, you still have that with 7 Remake, right? Because they're still co-developing that, so you kind of still have that very Japanese oriented art style, and party, it's not turn-based, obviously, but you still have lots of different party members and stuff. And so they can kind of have two sides of the coin here with different takes on it. So
we have your Western Final Fantasy over here, right? And your traditional Japanese, more traditional Japanese one over here. So
yeah,
I guess,
it reminds me of, actually. Yeah. I mean, when 10 came out, I remember my initial knee-jerk reaction to playing 10 was that I got really hung up on the fact that they took away the world map, which I was really wedded to that idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll freely admit that when 10 came out, I was like, what are they doing to this series? But over the passage of time, actually 10, I rank it among one of my favorites. I think the story delivered. The characters were fantastic. I thought it was great in hindsight. And everyone has the capacity to change their mind. So my point is if they did strip out the party members, right now it seems like a terrible idea, but we'd have to see. Yeah, we'd have to see. Whether they, it might deliver on everything else. We'd see.
It could, yeah, that's true.
Well, I do want to point one other thing out. When I was reading up on some things yesterday, I saw several interviews with Katase, who is on this Final Fantasy committee that's kind of going over the Final Fantasy series. And you can kind of see the start of when this committee was formed in 2013, where they start, that's when Tabata took over for 15. And then shortly after Katase and Yoshi P became executive directors at Square Enix, they pulled back Final Fantasy VII Remake back in house and back from CyberConnect 2 and said, no, we can do this better. And I see recent interviews with Katase where he's talking about, eventually passing the torch of Final Fantasy to somebody a little bit younger, but he's concerned about making sure that it's to somebody that can maintain the quality. And so it seems to me that they've been doing a lot of cleaning house with all the various consolidations and just, trying to fix everything, whether it's from 14, rebuilding that. Okay, let's put Final Fantasy 15 in Tabata's hands. Let's, just get the game out so we can get it off our radar. Okay, let's pull the 7 remake back in. Let's get this thing out. And I think that now we're at that point where this game is just, it's not a controversy at all. There's nothing surrounding it. It's fresh, it's new. And on top of that, the people that are approving Final Fantasy stuff, right? This committee, right? I've seen stuff with Katase where he talked about what the role of the committee is. And he said, look, my approach is as long as the person's passionate about it, I'm just going to say, go ahead with new games. Just like, I think that I don't even want to get involved with it. You do what you want to do as long as it's passionate. I'm concerned about deadlines. I'm concerned about the game getting out on time. I'm concerned about, are we getting too concerned with graphical fidelity and trying to outdo every other game on the planet, that this is going to take 18 years to come out. But as far as your, like, the way, you want to present Final Fantasy, that's on you, and that's a creative decision. And I think that is just, I think we're going to be surprised. I think that we're going to be in a new age with Square Enix where perhaps they've turned a new leaf with these games. And while it might be a little bit different, I think that's like, it's going to be a good thing. So it's just, I'm excited. That's what I want to get out there. So.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you guys want to talk about with 16? I feel like we've kind of, I mean, we it was a 4-minute trailer. We've gotten a little bit of news with it, but but we've kind of talked about it quite a lot. I saw that some people were criticizing the trailer for it has blood just to have blood, and I didn't think there was enough context for that yet, right?
Yeah.
A criticism of the trailer I've seen actually is, and I think this is interesting because it's something that I've raised on the channel before, but Final Fantasy, it has like a really strong female fan base. And I think that one of the things that was noted in the trailer, particularly among the who seem to be the kind of protagonistic characters, is the absence of the female or female lead or something like that. There was a sort of group of women and a young girl, it looked like. Again, it's early days, but it would be interesting to see how these roles are sort of delivered. Because on my channel, talking about 15, I did appeal to female gamers and say, were you detracted in any way that you had this group of guys? And for the most part, they sort of loved it. But yeah, now we're dealing with this kind of gritty, political, medieval thing, phallocentric characters by the looks of it. It's like, is this going to be a deterrent? Not sure. So interesting consideration there, I think.
Yeah, I've seen some similar comments. Just a lot of female gamers were okay with 15 being kind of the brotherhood thing, right? Where it was kind of exploring that dynamic, but they were a little disappointed with not having more of a main characters that were female outside of Cindy, who's kind of ridiculous. She's got her.
Yeah, exactly.
she's got her fan base. Aranea was kind of cool, but I've seen some people that were kind of like, "Hey, where's the female characters? The only real female character we've seen is, this queen that's kind of like telling Joshua you shouldn't be out in the courtyard, and the other woman that's got like the robe down here, and her cleavage is popping out and stuff, and so." Yeah, we'll see. I mean, we're going to see more game footage, and we're going to see a trailer in 2021. October, we're going to see some more stuff with this game, like the story and stuff. So it's possible that, what we saw was just really early. I mean, it's my opinion that all this trailer footage is from the first couple hours of the game. I think that most of the game we're going to play as this older character. And I think that, we only saw basically the backstory of our main hero, And I think that who knows what they're going to show, because Yoshi P did say we only saw a fraction of what they have in development. So I have to think that there was going to be some other story-based characters here for people to enjoy. So
yeah.
So we're getting more info this year then.
He said there's going to be a website for Final Fantasy 16 that's going to have things regarding the character and the world. So that would, to me, would
about a month from now, right?
Yeah. So
end of October. Yeah.
So hopefully we get a name. Because
what's his name?
Yeah, I'm getting really tired of just referring to him as the main character or the hero. You know, I'm like, give me a name. I just want to. I'm gonna call him Joe. So yeah. So we'll get some more information soon. But yeah, if you guys, as a kind of wrap up here, if you guys were betting people, I know I'm a big fan of this, but when do you guys think this thing's coming out? If you had to take a guess on it, obviously once we get more information. Stan, you want to take a stab?
Yeah, well, I was feeling like it would maybe come out end of 2022, but then inevitably get delayed, as all big budget Square Enix games are, and end up in early 2023. But I guess there's kind of like a sense that it's been in development longer than people realize, and maybe that this isn't like the too early of a reveal.
Yeah.
So now I am not sure. My guess is 2022 at some point, but maybe earlier in the year. Maybe around the same time that 7 Remake came out, like March, April of 2022. That's my prediction, I guess, as of now.
Fair enough. I'm sure you'll update that as we learn more. But Jack, if you were a guessing man, given you are Alleyway Jack, what would you guess?
Yeah, I want to be optimistic. I want to think that, they've learned from the mistakes of, announcing things too early. I think it seems like they have the right team in place, and that they know what they're doing. So yeah, I'm going to say early 2022.
Okay.
Maybe even the end of next year. There's my extreme optimism for you. Yeah.
That would be good. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's so confusing. It's so confusing what to say, because when I look at like the trailer, I'm like, well, if this was going to come out soon, why was it PC footage, right? Why wasn't it PS5 footage? But then there's rumors that are pretty strong indications that this trailer was supposed to be shown at the original PS5 reveal. Then they pushed it to this reveal because they wanted to do it before pre-orders. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And if that's the case, we're looking at game footage that's probably was recorded in like December or November last year. So this game's probably a year farther along than what we've seen. And I imagine it's PC footage because they were working on the PS4 version, right? And then Sony came along and said, hey, how much money is it going to cost to get this thing exclusive to the PS5? Okay, cool. Done. We'll pay it. All right, we want it at this event. And Square's just like, we haven't even gotten that far with the PS5 version. We're just working on the PS4 version. Sony's just like, we want ray tracing. Do it on PC, because the PS4 doesn't have ray tracing. So, that could have been what was going on there too. So it's very confusing, especially now that it's confirmed that it's probably going to be M-rated with this provisional rating. And Yoshi P is saying it's not going to take till 2035. There's these rumors that it's been in development for a while, but so I'm just like, I don't know what to believe. But I'm going to go with late 2022 again. And then I think I agree with Stan that it's going to be delayed till 2023. I think that makes sense because every Final Fantasy game gets delayed at least a month, or two. Yeah. And, so I think that's where it's going to be. But I guess we'll know for sure in 2021 if they start showing us, demos and stuff. Then maybe it will be 2021. So
yeah,
but
we'll find out.
Yep. Is there, I think that kind of wraps us up, though. Is there anything else anybody wants to get off their chest about Final Fantasy 16 before we call this to a close?
Don't think so. I hope we find out more about the exploration style of the game, I guess.
Mhm.
And maybe with that October update, like, is it going to be open world? Is it going to be zone based, or is it going to be like linear with like more open areas for like combat? Like, who knows at this point? There's not enough to tell based on the trailer, so can't really speculate about that too much. But
Yeah,
we'll see.
Yep, agreed. Totally agree. All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap us up. Jack, really, really appreciate you coming on here and chatting with us and doing some speculation with us as well. It's just always good to have another opinion and to converse with these things on, especially from someone who I really enjoy listening to your thoughts on your YouTube channel, Alleyway Jack. So it's been awesome being able to talk with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me on, guys. Yeah, it's been great.
Yeah.
It's been great.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap us up, and we will have a follow-up podcast later in the week to discuss some of the other news that's been out there with, some of the PlayStation 5 reveals and the extremely aggressive acquisition of Bethesda by Microsoft, and what's this mean for RPGs and some other things as well. So it should be a pretty good week for you guys that enjoy the show, but I think that's going to end it here. So thank you guys.
Yep.
Thanks.
See you.